Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today I'd like to speak about 5 of my favourite pieces and the most notable pieces, at least in my eyes, from yesterday's Daytona Ultimatum auction at Phillips. And this is running at a similar time as the Geneva Watch auction number 7, which is running indeed today, and it was also running yesterday. And I won't be talking about the variety of fascinating timepieces in that auction, though I would strongly encourage you to go onto the Phillips auction website and take a look, because there are some fascinating lots to take a look at, which are being sold, with notable pieces like, for example, lot number 116, which is a beautiful reference 1019 Rolex Milgauss, which really is a magnificent piece. But today I'd like to focus on the Rolex Daytona, which has enjoyed a great deal of fame over the last few months and popularity as a result of both some extremely expensive pieces being sold, but also because of the sale, which of course is pretty unavoidable in terms of discussion, of Paul Newman's Paul Newman Daytona for a record price last year. Since its inception in 1963, the Rolex Daytona has really been the chronograph of the Rolex brand. And sadly, for many of those years, this wasn't a particularly well appreciated watch, with watches such as the Omega Speedmaster commanding higher sales, whilst the Rolex Daytona wasn't particularly popular until the 90s. And this is a watch which now has grown to incredible popularity, and is one of the watches in the Rolex lineup with the longest waiting lists, and as a result the highest resale prices. And this is particularly seen, of course, in the new ceramic Daytonas, which were selling for 1.5 times their retail price from second-hand owners, up to about a year after its first introduction. And this is a watch which has a timeless design, which has changed remarkably little, with a very obvious change from the early models to the more modern models, but still with that iconic DNA that the original watch had, with that tri-compact no-date layout and that external tachymeter. And so the watches I'm talking about today are interesting for the details, for the little elements on the dials, the cases, and indeed their unique nature, which makes them notable to a collector, and indeed interesting for simply those who find vintage timepieces and their history really quite fascinating. Now the first watch I'd like to talk about is very well portrayed by its lot number, which happens to be lot number 8. Now, lot number 8 was the same lot number used for Paul Newman's Paul Newman Daytona, sold in the Winning Icons sale. And as a result, this lot number does suggest the high expectations made for this timepiece. And this is a reference 6265 Rolex Daytona, which they estimate was sold in 1971 and produced in 1970. And what's unique about this watch is that, theoretically at least, one should really refer to it as the 6265/9. And those who've collected Rolexes or know the reference number style will know that by 9 I refer to white gold. Now the case of this watch is, as I've said, white gold, but due to the fact that it's natural white gold, it ends up having this slightly golden tint to its white coloration, which is both unique on this reference of Rolex Daytona, but also quite beautiful in terms of its appearance, and gives a look which is wholly different to steel. Interestingly, the bracelet features a very different finish to a standard Rolex Daytona bracelet, because as you can see, it isn't the conventional style of Oyster bracelet. Instead, we see a white gold bracelet with this beautiful bark finish and these seamlessly attached links, which give a flowing aesthetic to this watch and a far more luxurious look than a conventional Oyster bracelet would. Also, this bracelet does have a difference in colour to the case, because it is rhodium plated rather than having that bare, natural white gold colour, and as a result creates a contrast which again does give a unique form to this watch, whilst the attachment points are also slightly different in terms of the end links. Now, still remaining on the subject of the case, the watch does have an interesting detail being the crown. And whilst the rest of the case is, as I've said, white gold, and the pushers also match this in their screw-down configuration on this Oyster case Daytona, as seen by the fact that this watch is 6265, the crown is stainless steel, which creates a beautiful contrast in colour and a very interesting detail in the watch, which already is by no means limited in terms of information and interest as far as a vintage watch goes. And of course this watch is unique on the market, and as a result is a piece which I certainly wasn't particularly sure how to go about talking about. But certainly I feel the details of this watch are fascinating in terms of what they show about this uniquely commissioned timepiece. The dial of this watch isn't an exotic dial, as is usually the case on the most valuable of Daytonas, but rather features a black layout without the Daytona writing, with white subdials. It also is a Sigma dial, as it has those 2 marks at the bottom of the dial, which sit on either side of the Swiss, referencing the white gold coronet at 12 o'clock. Rather unsurprisingly for a unique watch, the estimate for the sale price of this watch was rather high, with an estimate of between 3 million and 5 million Swiss francs, with the final hammer price being 5 million. That means that the final price of the watch is 5,937,500 Swiss francs. The following watch I'd like to speak about is lot number 24, the reference 6241 John Player Special. Now, the naming of this watch is fairly obvious, because the watch is gold and black, and of course this mirrors the design of the 1970s livery seen on Lotuses, such as Emerson Fittipaldi's iconic Lotus 72, which I think epitomised that period of Formula One, powered by the incredible and extremely long-lived Ford 4 valve. Of course, this watch does predate that car, being produced between 1966 and 1969. However, as far as a beautiful demonstration of the Daytona in this particular reference, one really won't see any better than this watch. And the interesting details about this watch is the fact that it is a pump pusher chronograph model of the Daytona, so it doesn't feature the screw-down pushers seen on, for example, the white gold 6265 we just saw. Instead, it has these pump pushers which don't screw down and are in matching gold to the case. The crown also sits level with those and doesn't protrude in the same way as is sometimes seen on reference 6239s, for instance, from the earlier versions of the Daytona. Instead, the crown remains level with these and does give that tremendous aesthetic, which I think makes this one of the purest and cleanest of designs in the Daytona range. Of course, the case is in incredibly good condition, with retained brushing on the top of the lugs and that wonderful polishing on the sides. Likewise, as per its reference, it does have the beautiful Bakelite bezel, which is inset into that bezel itself as an insert. It is also graduated from 200 to 50, as is standard for this period. The dial condition of this watch really can't be described as anything other than breathtaking, because the dial has this wonderful gilt tone to those subdials and the second track running around the edge of the dial, whilst a deep black, which has turned to a slight grey on the rest of the dial, is also present. And of course, the more eagle-eyed of viewers will, of course, have recognised this is an exotic dial, as seen on the most valuable of Daytonas, which gives that unique design to the dial itself, with a style which is less utilitarian than the standard design, and possibly less legible, in favour of being more stylish. Likewise, the dial itself is completely untouched, which just adds to the interest of this watch to a collector, and indeed anyone else who enjoys seeing these watches as they were. Interestingly, the Daytona is also written in a gilt form on the bottom of the dial, with of course that golden coronet at 12 o'clock, just above Rolex and Cosmograph, creating a watch which is of beautiful style, and of course value which really does match it. And the estimate for the price of this watch is significantly less than that white gold model, between 500,000 Swiss francs and 1 million Swiss francs, with the final price ending up at 912,500, which sits at the higher end of that spectrum, but nonetheless is a remarkable piece, and something which certainly won't be come across very often. The following watch has been discussed quite extensively over the past few weeks prior to the auction itself, and is a model which, at base in terms of its form, just appears as an extremely well preserved and very beautifully maintained reference 6263. And this is lot number 21, which is of course a 6263 with that beautiful Bakelite bezel insert and a wonderful black dial, which isn't a tropical style dial but a conventional one. And this watch is one of the Oyster Daytonas, so it has the screw-down pushers, as well as that screw-down crown to give the watch a certain water resistance which simply wasn't present on earlier models, with of course that proprietary water-resistant case, which is so recognisable for Rolexes. The case condition is excellent, with brushing on the top of the lugs and polishing on the sides as they should be, with the retaining sharp edges still seen, and of course drilled lugs which were typical of watches of this era to facilitate the changing of straps. Likewise, the bracelet is in fact the first bracelet we've seen in this video to be the classic, the Oyster, which of course fits with this particular period extremely well, bearing in mind the fact that these watches were designed to be water-resistant alternatives, which could be used on a more practical level than their predecessors. Of course, the watch itself is stainless steel, as you would expect, but the detail on this watch, this 1974 watch in fact, is the dial. The most striking, and indeed obvious optional difference rather to a conventional Daytona on this watch is seen in those indices, or rather the lack thereof. Because this watch, instead of having the conventional applied indices, which would be seen and shown by the fact the watch would have a drilled dial with mounting points for each of those indices, this watch features a different solution, as this watch is known as the Arabian Night. And this is seen in the fact that the watch has Arabic numerals around the dial instead of those indices, which are painted on with a lacquer rather than tritium, as opposed to the tritium lined hands, which does reduce the legibility of the watch, but rather does replace this style with something which really is extremely different. And these watches have never been seen before at auction, rather, and this watch is the only one that's been seen available for sale. And so as a result, the price was always going to be rather high for this timepiece, though I will brush on this later, is slightly less than I would have expected. Inside the watch, the movement is, as expected, a 727 manually wound chronograph movement seen in these watches of this period, and is unsurprising in that regard, but certainly is something you would expect in one of these watches, and doesn't disappoint. The watch also does have that Sigma dial with those two marks at 6 o'clock, with that white gold crown at 12 o'clock as well, which again adds to the interest of this watch in this black dial with white subdial layout. And the price of this watch ended up being 1.9325 million Swiss francs, which is significantly below the top end of the estimate of 3 million, but still well clear of 1.5 million being the bottom. And of course was no bad sale for this watch, though I must say, bearing in mind the rarity, I think this watch did go for less than I would have expected. But one interesting detail about this watch to consider is the fact that this dial must have been created for this watch to start off with no change in terms of putting a conventional dial and then repainting it. Because a conventional dial would have neat holes in the case into which those indices would slot, whereas on this watch no such holes exist, indicating the fact that this lacquer was meant to be placed there from the start, and thus creating a more interesting timepiece, and potentially a more valuable one in future if it ever comes up for sale again. At first, this following lot 14, being a Cosmograph Daytona reference 6263 Oyster Sotto, is a timepiece which may at first not appear to be anything particularly special. However, the reason why this watch is so interesting is because it takes all of the most interesting aspects and most famous aspects of the Paul Newman-style Daytona and combines them together in a wonderfully collectible package, which is also extremely rare. Now, starting with the basics, this watch is a 1969 piece in stainless steel, with brushed tops to the lugs, polished sides, and of course an Oyster bracelet in matching stainless steel. Being a reference 6263, the watch also features those screw-down pushes and screw-down crown, yielding a certain water resistance which wouldn't have been seen on prior models. But the design of the watch is quite remarkable, because this is the piece which remains in people's minds because it has the style of exotic dial. And the exotic dial features those stylised numerals and those very distinct subdials, which don't feature the same levelling and detailing in some ways as the conventional dials, but do appear different to anything else on the market. Likewise, the edge of the dial features these red graduations for the second hand, and allow a certain accuracy and a greater accuracy than would previously have been seen on other watches in terms of being able to see between those indices for the seconds. Then, of course, one has Daytona in red on the dial, which is something which immediately draws on the racing heritage of this watch, and makes it all the more exciting for a potential owner or buyer of this watch. But the whole configuration comes together with that Bakelite bezel as the most desirable configuration there really is of Daytona. But as if this wasn't enough, the real reason why this watch is worth well over £1 million Swiss francs is due to the fact that this watch has details which are of interest. And this is so often the case with Daytonas that the price is in the details. And this is seen in the fact the watch has Rolex Cosmograph Oyster in that order descending on the dial. And this makes the watch, as it's named, the Oyster Sotto, with Oyster below the Cosmograph, as would be suggested by the name. And these with the Mark I exotic dials are incredibly rare, with an estimated less than 20 having been produced, which as a result makes the price infinitely infinitely higher, and indeed the watch infinitely more desirable than simply a conventional version of this watch. And certainly the condition of the timepiece doesn't hurt either, bearing in mind that it is really in beautiful condition, despite the fact that one can see a degree of wear on the case. This doesn't hurt the price whatsoever. Now, the value of this watch is only further boosted by the fact that it still features its documents with the Rolex Garanzia from November 22nd, 1972. And as a result, this watch is the complete package. It's about the most desirable of these exotic dialed styles of 6263s you could possibly wish for. And in that regard, I think this is one of the best watches at the auction, in terms of being something which isn't necessarily as strikingly unique as is the case with other timepieces, but is something which is of fascinating interest, and which is about as iconic as you can get a Daytona to be. Now, within this watch beats the 727 manual chronograph movement, and the price for this watch was an estimated 1 million to 2 million Swiss francs, with the final hammer price being above a million, but the final sales price being 1,662,500 Swiss francs. Certainly going above that estimate, but in a way still falling short of what I would have expected for a watch of this particular design and quality and condition. The final watch I'd like to speak about is a Rolex Daytona reference 6239 called the Ancestor. And this piece is my favourite watch at the auction by far. And the reason why it is not because it's particularly valuable. In fact, it's by no means one of the most expensive pieces sold there, and in fact comes in at a fraction of the price of the other watches I've talked about, which is still an incredibly high 275,000 Swiss francs. But nonetheless, this is a stainless steel chronograph from 1963. And as a result, this watch is the very start of the Daytona story, and as such has a few quirks which simply excite my watch lover's side, and show me something which really is different to what I would normally expect from a Daytona. Now, the watch itself features the caliber 72B, as with these original watches, and of course doesn't feature an Oyster case because it is one of these earlier models. But the bezel is the first area where one sees something of real interest, because the bezel is this plain polished bezel, as you can see, graduated to 300, which lasted until 1967, and as a result shows that aspect of this watch, which was earlier than those other 200 graduation bezels seen on later models. Likewise, the bezel also has the quirk of having 275 on it, which wouldn't normally be seen, and also the fact one has these hashes all going all the way around the dial, rather than the dots one sees later on, creating a watch which is distinctly different and more delicate in many ways to later Daytonas. Then, of course, one has the pump pushers, which are again something which is typical of this particular style of watch, without that Oyster water resistance, which again is something which simply interests me in terms of a design and a style, which matches that riveted bracelet, which appears somewhat tinny and thin compared to a modern bracelet, but simply works so well with this slimmed case. Within the 36.5mm case, which is about a millimetre thinner than the other watches in this video, this watch features a dial which again is of extremely high interest, because it's a matte black dial, as you can see, which is extraordinarily well preserved, with those white subdials which aren't in the exotic style, but rather in the conventional Daytona format, with those applied indices and luminescent pips. But interestingly, we see Rolex Cosmograph with a line underneath it, and there is a lot of debate as to what this line actually means, but most people would agree that this line marks the change in Rolex watches from radium to tritium, because one sees a lowered radioactivity on these watches, on the hands and the dials, on these particular series of watches with the line, which again makes this watch extremely important historically to the Daytona series, and very interesting to a collector who knows what they're looking at. Likewise, the dial is double-signed, and this is where a Swiss signature has been put underneath the graduations around the edge of the dial, but which is almost completely concealed by the placement of the bezel and the case, and as a result it's been reprinted above that bottom of the dial in a second demonstration of Swiss below that central subdial. And this again is a small detail, but just adds interest and value to this watch as far as a historical item goes, beyond the purpose of a timepiece itself, but rather as something like a museum artefact, which just shows these transitions towards what we now know as Rolex Daytonas. And as a final detail, these watches do appear significantly more dress-orientated than their later, far more stocky counterparts in the Daytona range. And this is seen in the elongation of the hands, seen in this particular series of watches, and seen in this particular example as well, just creating a more elegant timepiece, and something which shows the origins of a watch, which has changed so much in its time, yet retained that DNA and that style, which is so typical to this timepiece and really couldn't really be mistaken. And so do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of these particular watches and these variations on such a classic theme, and indeed the prices of these watches, which I think do take a while to get used to. And do tell me if there are any particular models in this video which particularly interested you, and if there are any which you have any questions or curious details about that I might have missed out. And so if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.